In the heart of Compton, where the streets echo the beat of resistance, a routine bus ride turns into a battleground for justice. When a racist bus driver demands that Snoop Dogg sit at the back, the legendary rapper refuses to comply. As tensions rise, an entire bus full of passengers must decide, will they stand by or stand up? The city bus groaned to a halt on a busy street in Compton, its doors hissing open. Commuters lined the sidewalk, bundled against the early morning chill. Among them was Snoop Dogg, a famous rapper known for his calm demeanor and iconic style, his head held high, his eyes sharp behind his sunglasses. He clutched his phone tightly as he stepped onto the bus, nodding politely to the driver, Michael Henderson, whose scowl deepened as Snoop dropped his coins into the fare box. Snoop paused to adjust his balance before moving forward. "Hurry it up!" Henderson barked, his voice gruff and impatient. Snoop glanced at him briefly but said nothing, choosing instead to make his way toward an empty seat near the front of the bus. He grasped the pole and steadied himself as the bus jerked into motion, his eyes scanning the quiet faces around him. "Not there!" Henderson called out sharply, loud enough to cut through the silence. Snoop stopped mid-step, turning slowly to face him. "Excuse me, you don't sit there. Seats up front aren't for you. Back of the bus," Henderson insisted. A hush fell over the passengers. A young woman near the window lowered her gaze, nervously pulling her toddler closer. An older man shifted uncomfortably, his newspaper suddenly fascinating. Snoop's calm expression didn't falter. He took a measured step forward. "I've paid my fare," he said, his voice clear and steady. "I'll sit where I please." Henderson slammed the brakes, the bus lurching violently. Passengers grabbed at poles and seats to steady themselves. The driver stood abruptly, pointing a finger at Snoop. "You don't make the rules here, man. Either you move to the back or you're off this bus. Your choice." The murmur of the passengers grew louder, a mix of surprise and unease. A young man in the middle row pulled out his phone, the faint glow of its camera light visible as he began recording. Snoop straightened his shoulders and met Henderson's glare, his face remaining impassive, but his eyes burned with a quiet defiance. "I'm not going anywhere," he said firmly. Henderson's face reddened with fury. "We'll see about that." He grabbed the radio from his console and barked for transit security. The tension on the bus thickened as all eyes turned to Snoop, waiting to see what would happen next. Outside, the first signs of a crowd started to form, curious about the sudden stop. The bus remained idle on the crowded street, the low hum of its engine filling the tense silence. Snoop stood firm, his fingers lightly gripping the cold silver rail near the front seats. The passengers around him exchanged uneasy glances, their whispers growing louder as the confrontation dragged on. "I'm not going to repeat myself," Henderson barked. Stepping out from behind the driver's seat, his uniform stretched tightly over his broad shoulders, his face flushed with irritation. "Move to the back of the bus or I'll have you removed." Snoop looked up at him, his expression calm but unyielding. "I've done nothing wrong. I paid my fare. I'll sit where I please." Henderson's hands clenched into fists at his sides. "You think you're special? I make the rules on this bus. If I tell you to move, you move." A murmur rippled through the passengers. A young mother near the front shifted uncomfortably, pulling her squirming toddler onto her lap. An older man in a suit adjusted his tie, his gaze fixed firmly out the window. A teenage girl whispered loudly enough for everyone to hear, "This is ridiculous!" Snoop didn't raise his voice, but his words carried across the bus. "I'm not breaking any rules. What you're doing is wrong and you know it." The driver's face twisted in fury. "You don't get to tell me what's right. You're disturbing everyone else here. People are trying to get to work." He gestured broadly at the passengers as if expecting their agreement. The majority remained silent, avoiding eye contact. From the middle of the bus, a young man with earbuds dangling from his ears raised his phone slightly, the faint red light of the recording visible. "You're the one holding us up, man," he said loudly. "He's just trying to sit." Henderson turned his glare on the young man. "Stay out of it." "This isn't your concern." The young man leaned back, undeterred, and kept filming. The bus jerked slightly as Henderson stomped back to his seat and grabbed the radio, his voice crackling through the speaker as he called in his complaint. "Dispatch, this is Route 23. I have a passenger refusing to comply, requesting transit security at my location. The murmur of the passengers grew louder.
He's not doing anything wrong,
A woman near the back muttered, her voice barely audible. Why is he making such a fuss? Snoop turned to face the other passengers, his gaze sweeping across their hesitant faces. This isn't just about me, it's about what's right. Spare us the speech, Henderson snapped, cutting him off. You're off this bus the second security gets here. A little boy sitting with his mother tugged on her sleeve. Why is the driver yelling at him, Mommy? He asked in a loud whisper. The mother hushed him quickly, glancing nervously at Henderson. Snoop smiled gently at the child. Sometimes people don't like being challenged when they know they're wrong, he said softly. Don't talk to him, Henderson barked, his voice booming. His frustration seemed to grow with every passing moment. The passengers flinched as his outburst echoed through the bus. The young man with the phone spoke up again, his voice steady. You're digging yourself into a hole, man. Everyone's going to see this. Henderson glared at him but said nothing, his jaw tightening. The faint sound of a siren began to pierce the tense atmosphere, signaling the arrival of transit security. Snoop didn't move, his calm, steady presence standing in stark contrast to the chaos Henderson seemed determined to create. The passengers fell silent, their eyes darting between Snoop and the driver. The bus door hissed open as Henderson prepared for the arrival of the officers. Snoop remained poised, his shoulders back and his chin held high. We'll see what they have to say, he said quietly, his words filled with quiet defiance. As the sound of the siren grew louder, the tension on the bus reached its breaking point. Everyone waited, the weight of the moment pressing down on them like a heavy, unrelenting tide. The siren's wail grew louder, cutting through the uneasy silence inside the bus. Snoop stood firm, his hand still resting on the silver rail. Henderson returned to his seat but kept shooting glances at him, his expression a mix of frustration and defiance. The other passengers murmured quietly among themselves, the tension thick enough to weigh down the already stale air. A young mother with a toddler, seated a few rows back, finally broke the silence. Why doesn't he just move? She muttered under her breath, though her words carried enough weight to be heard. This is holding everyone up. I would have moved. The man next to her chimed in, his voice low but tinged with irritation. Not worth the fight. Snoop turned his head slightly in their direction. Some fights are worth it, he said simply, his voice calm but unmistakably firm. He met the mother's gaze briefly before returning his focus to the front of the bus. The young man with the phone recording leaned forward. He's got a point. Why is he even bothering him in the first place? There's nothing wrong with sitting up front. Henderson shot him a sharp glare, his voice cutting through the murmurs. Stay in your lane, kid. This doesn't concern you, doesn't it? The man shot back, his tone steady. You're making it everyone's business by stopping the bus. Several passengers shifted uncomfortably. A teenage girl sitting a few rows ahead of Snoop whispered to the woman beside her, I can't believe this is happening. It's like something out of a history book. Yeah, the woman replied, her voice low. But it's not history. It's now. The faint sound of footsteps approached as the siren's wail tapered off. Transit security was here. The bus door hissed open and 2 officers stepped on board, their dark uniforms standing out against the bright morning sunlight streaming in through the windows. Henderson was on his feet instantly. Finally, he's been refusing to comply, he said, jabbing a finger in Snoop's direction. Holding up the bus and causing a scene, the officers turned their attention to Snoop, their faces neutral. Sir, one of them began, his tone measured. We've been called because you're refusing to follow the driver's instructions. Can you tell us what's going on? Snoop held his ground, his voice calm but unwavering. I paid my fare like everyone else here. He demanded I move to the back of the bus for no reason other than his own prejudice. That's not true, Henderson interjected, his voice rising. I told him these seats are priority seats. He doesn't belong here. Priority for who? Snoop countered, his gaze sharp. The elderly? I certainly qualify. Or are there other criteria I'm unaware of? The officer hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. The other passengers watched intently, a few nodding at Snoop's words. The young man with the phone tilted it slightly, making sure to catch the officers, Henderson, and Snoop all in frame. Sir, the easiest thing would be to move to another seat, the second officer said, his tone placating. We're just trying to resolve this without further delay. I'm not the one delaying the bus, Snoop replied. He is. If I step off now, he'll think he can keep treating people this way. And he'll be right. The teenage girl who had whispered earlier suddenly stood up. He's right, she said loudly, her voice trembling slightly but resolute. Why should he have to move? He's the one being a jerk. Sit down, Henderson barked, his frustration boiling over. You want to get thrown off too? That's enough, the first officer said sharply, holding up a hand to calm the driver. Sir, we'll handle this. The young man with the phone spoke up again, his tone defiant. Everyone's already seen what you're doing, man. This video is going to be everywhere by tonight. The murmurs among the passengers grew louder. A man in a suit near the back of the bus, who had been silent until now, finally spoke. Look, this is ridiculous. He hasn't done anything wrong. Just let him stay where he is and we can all get moving. Henderson's face turned a deeper shade of red, his hands clenching into fists. You people don't get it. Rules are rules. You can't just let anyone sit up here. Anyone? Snoop said, his voice cutting through the chaos. Or just people who look like me? The bus fell silent again, the weight of his words hanging heavily in the air. The officers exchanged uneasy glances, clearly aware of the tension. Outside, pedestrians began to gather near the bus, curious about the commotion. The young man with the phone turned his camera toward the crowd, capturing their growing interest. We need to make a decision, the second officer said, his voice tight. Sir, are you willing to step off the bus so we can de-escalate the situation? Snoop straightened his shoulders, his expression unyielding. No, I've done nothing wrong, and I won't be treated like this, not today. The officers hesitated, their authority caught between the calm defiance of the famous rapper and the fiery tension of an increasingly agitated bus driver. Henderson shook his head, muttering under his breath as he returned to his seat. The atmosphere in the bus was electric, every passenger on edge as the standoff continued. Outside, more people gathered, their murmurs joining the faint sounds of car horns and distant chatter. Snoop didn't move, his quiet dignity speaking louder than any argument could. He was a pillar of resolve in the chaos, refusing to back down from the injustice thrust upon him. The crowd outside the bus grew larger, their curious murmurs floating through the open doors. Inside, the atmosphere simmered with tension. Snoop remained steady, his posture unyielding as the officers exchanged looks, unsure how to proceed. Passengers shifted in their seats, the unease palpable. One of the officers sighed and turned back to Henderson. Sir, what exactly are you asking us to do here? He's not being aggressive or posing a threat. Henderson threw up his hands in frustration. Are you serious? He's refusing to follow instructions. I can't do my job with someone like him up here, disrupting everything. A young woman near the middle of the bus, her voice quivering but defiant, called out, You're the one making the scene, not him? Several passengers murmured in agreement. The teenage girl who had spoken earlier stood up again, her hands clutching the edge of the seat for balance. Yeah, he's just sitting there. What's the big deal? Henderson's glare shot toward her. You want me to throw you off too? Sit down and stay out of it. The officer raised a hand to calm him. Let's keep this civil, he said, his voice firm but tired. He turned back to Snoop. Sir, are you sure you won't consider just moving to another seat? It might make things easier for everyone. Snoop's gaze never wavered. I've done nothing wrong. If I move, it will be easier for him, not everyone, and I won't give him the satisfaction. The tension was broken by the sound of a phone chiming loudly. The young man who had been recording the incident smirked and held up his phone. Looks like it's already online. Over 1,000 views in 5 minutes. Henderson's face darkened, his jaw clenching as his anger threatened to boil over. You put this on the internet? He growled, his voice low but menacing. Damn right I did, the young man replied, undeterred. People need to see this. You can't treat people like this and think you'll get away with it. A ripple of approval moved through the passengers. Even those who had been silent now murmured their agreement. The man in the suit near the back spoke up, his voice calm but sharp. This isn't 1955. He has every right to sit where he wants. Henderson slammed his fist onto the dashboard, the loud thud silencing the murmurs. "I've had it!" he shouted. "He's off this bus or we're not going anywhere." The officers stiffened at his tone, their own patience wearing thin. The first officer stepped forward, his expression hardening. "Sir, if you keep escalating this, you're going to be the one facing consequences. You've called us here to handle the situation, so let us do our job." Outside, the crowd began to grow louder, people pressing closer to the bus, some raising their phones to record the scene. A man in a construction vest called out, "What's going on in there? Why isn't the bus moving?" "Driver's being a racist jerk," someone yelled from the back of the bus, drawing laughter and cheers from the gathering crowd. The second officer rubbed his temples, clearly feeling the pressure. He turned back to Snoop, his tone softer but still urging. "Sir, I understand your position and I don't blame you, but this is getting bigger by the minute. Are you sure you want to keep this going?" Snoop glanced at the crowd outside, their faces a mix of curiosity and growing outrage. His eyes swept over the passengers, some watching him with sympathy, others with exasperation. Finally, he looked at the young man recording the incident and gave him a small nod. "Yes," he said, his voice unwavering. "I'm sure. This isn't about me, it's about what's right." The officer straightened, nodding in reluctant acknowledgement. "All right, sir. Then we'll stay until we can resolve this properly." Henderson let out a derisive laugh. "You're just going to let him get away with this? Unbelievable." The officer turned sharply toward him. "One more outburst, and I'll have you reported for misconduct." The driver fell silent, his face a mask of barely contained rage. The tension in the bus was electric, every passenger hanging on the edge of their seats. Outside, the crowd grew louder, their voices forming a faint chant that reached the ears of everyone on board. "Let him sit! Let him sit!" Snoop finally took his seat near the front, his head held high, his quiet defiance seeming to radiate strength, a stark contrast to Henderson's growing agitation. The officers exchanged a final glance before stepping outside to address the crowd, leaving the driver fuming and the passengers buzzing with murmurs of approval. The young man with the phone grinned, lowering it briefly to address Snoop. "You're a legend, man. This video is going to blow up." Snoop gave him a faint smile but said nothing, his focus still on Henderson. The fight wasn't over yet, but for the first time, the tide seemed to be turning in his favor. The officers stepped off the bus, the weight of the growing crowd pressing down on the tension already simmering inside. The chant outside had grown louder, the rhythmic, "Let him sit, echoing through the open doors. Passengers exchanged glances, their unease now mingling with curiosity. Snoop sat poised, his back straight, his gaze fixed on the windshield ahead. He could feel Henderson's glare boring into him from his seat, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. The young man with the phone held it up again, panning across the passengers to capture their reactions. "You see this?" he said, his voice loud enough to carry. "This is what standing up looks like. Y'all better remember his face because he's making history right now." Henderson snapped his head toward the young man. "Turn that damn thing off. You're disrupting this bus just as much as he is." The young man smirked. "Disrupting? Nah, I'm documenting." "There's a difference." Another passenger, a middle-aged woman with a worn leather bag, spoke up for the first time. "Honestly, we should all be documenting this. He's treating him like garbage for no reason." Henderson turned his attention to her, his anger spilling over. "Lady, you don't know what you're talking about. I've been driving this route for years, and I know how to handle troublemakers." "Troublemaker?" The teenage girl from earlier shot back, standing again despite the driver's earlier threats. "He's literally just sitting there. How's that trouble?" "You all want to play hero, huh?" Henderson barked, his voice rising. "Fine, but don't come crying to me when this bus doesn't move." From the back of the bus, a man in a suit stood, his face calm, but his voice firm. "We've all been sitting here long enough. If you can't handle this professionally, maybe you shouldn't be driving." Henderson's face turned crimson. "You think you can do my job better, pal? Be my guest." "Maybe I would if it meant treating people like humans," the man retorted, sitting back down as murmurs of agreement rippled through the bus. Outside, the chants grew louder, joined by the occasional car horn as drivers slowed to observe the commotion. The officers stood by the door, trying to manage the swelling crowd. A reporter with a camera pushed her way to the front, the red recording light visible through the bus's grimy window. Henderson, now visibly rattled, grabbed the radio again. "Dispatch, this is Route 23. Situation's getting worse. There's a crowd outside now. We need more officers." The radio crackled in response. "Additional units are en route. Hold tight." Snoop let out a quiet breath, his composure never wavering. He glanced at the young man still filming. "You should focus on what's happening outside, too," he said softly. "This is bigger than just this bus." He nodded and angled his phone toward the crowd, capturing the chant and the faces of those demanding justice. "You're right," he said, "but you're still the star here." Henderson slammed his hand onto the dashboard, the sound startling some of the passengers. "I'm sick of this circus. Everyone who has a problem with me, get off my bus right now." No one moved. The teenage girl crossed her arms defiantly. The man in the suit stared out the window, and the young mother clutched her child tighter but stayed silent. Even those who had been reluctant earlier now seemed rooted to their seats, their quiet solidarity a stark rebuke to the driver's outburst. Snoop turned his head slowly to look at Henderson. His voice was low but carried through the bus. "You don't get to decide who belongs here. That's not your job." Henderson's mouth opened as if to retort, but he hesitated, his jaw tightening. His authority was slipping, and he knew it. The chants outside were growing louder, the crowd swelling into a small sea of people. Phones and cameras pointed toward the bus, capturing every moment. One of the officers re-entered the bus, his face tight with frustration. "Driver," he said firmly, "we need to de-escalate this now. The crowd's growing, and the media's here. This situation is out of control." Henderson scoffed, throwing his hands up. "Oh, so now it's my fault? I told you how to handle this." "Get him off the bus." The officer shook his head. No, if we try to force him off now, we're going to have a bigger problem on our hands. The crowd's not on your side." Snoop's lips curved into the faintest hint of a smile. He turned his attention back to the window where signs had begun to appear in the crowd. One read, "Justice for Snoop." Another, scrolled hastily on cardboard, simply said, "End the hate." Henderson sank into his seat, his face a mask of fury and helplessness. Snoop remained calm, his presence unshaken. The energy in the bus shifted. The passengers no longer felt like mere observers. They were witnesses to something bigger than a morning commute. The officer turned to Snoop, his voice softer. "Sir, we're working on resolving this. Just stay seated." He nodded, folding his hands in his lap. "I wasn't planning on moving." The officer exited the bus again, and Henderson sat in smoldering silence. The noise from the crowd outside was now deafening, a chorus of voices calling for justice. Inside the bus, the passengers seemed to sit a little straighter, their nervous energy replaced by quiet resolve. The world was watching, and Snoop Dogg was at the center of it all. The officer's voice crackled from his radio outside, trying to manage the growing crowd. Inside the bus, the tension had reached a breaking point. Henderson sat stiffly in his seat, glaring at Snoop, his fingers tapping impatiently against the steering wheel, each motion sharper than the last. Snoop remained composed, his chin high as he stared out the window at the sea of faces demanding justice. The chants outside, let him sit," echoed louder, reverberating through the walls of the bus. "You think you're some kind of hero?" Henderson growled, his voice barely contained. He stood abruptly, his chair creaking from the force. "You're not. You're just another troublemaker making my life harder." Snoop didn't flinch, his calm demeanor amplifying Henderson's anger. "What I am," he said, his voice steady, "is someone who's tired of being pushed around. If you can't handle that, maybe you're in the wrong job." His face flushed crimson. "That's it? I'm done playing nice." He stalked towards Snoop, the veins in his neck pulsing with barely restrained rage. The passengers gasped. Several shouted in protest. "What are you doing?" the teenage girl cried, standing halfway up in her seat. "You can't do that." "Don't touch him! Don't touch him!" yelled the young man with the phone, angling his camera to capture Henderson's every move. Henderson ignored them all, his focus solely on Snoop. He loomed over him, his large frame blocking out the light from the windows. "I told you to get off my bus," he snarled, "and if you won't do it yourself, I'll make you—" Snoop's expression didn't waver. You lay one finger on me and you'll regret it. The warning didn't deter him. Henderson grabbed Snoop's arm roughly, yanking him halfway out of the seat. The passengers erupted in outrage, several leaping to their feet. "Stop him!" someone shouted. The young man recording bolted forward, his phone still trained on the scene. "Let him go!" he yelled, but Henderson shoved him back with his free hand, sending him stumbling into another seat. Snoop winced but refused to cry out, his resolve unshaken even as Henderson dragged him farther from his seat. "This is assault," Snoop said firmly. "You're not above the law no matter what you think." The doors of the bus slammed open and the officers charged back inside. "Stop right now!" one of them barked, his hand instinctively reaching for his belt. "Driver, let him go!" Henderson froze but didn't release him immediately. His head whipped toward the officers, his anger now mixed with defiance. "He's disrupting my bussy. I'm just doing my job." "That's not your job!" the officer snapped, stepping forward. "If you don't let him go this second, you're going to be in cuffs." Henderson hesitated for a fraction of a second before releasing Snoop's arm. He settled back into his seat, his composure intact despite the ordeal. The officer turned to him, concern flashing across his face. "Sir, are you all right?" "I'm fine," Snoop said, smoothing his sleeve. His voice was steady, but his eyes remained fixed on Henderson. "But he isn't." The second officer stepped forward, his handcuffs glinting in the light. "Driver, you're under arrest for assault. Turn around and put your hands behind your back." "What?" Henderson roared, his voice echoing through the bus. "You can't be serious. I'm the one in charge here." "Not anymore," the officer replied coldly. He grabbed Henderson's arm and spun him around, locking the cuffs into place. Henderson struggled, but the officer's grip was firm. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." The passengers watched in stunned silence as Henderson was marched down the aisle, his protests drowned out by the chants from outside. "This is ridiculous!" he yelled, craning his neck to glare at Snoop. "You'll regret this, man!" Snoop finally broke his silence, his voice calm but cutting. "I think the only one with regrets here will be you." The officer guided Henderson down the bus steps and into the arms of the growing crowd, where cameras and phones flashed in every direction. The reporter outside shouted questions as Henderson was loaded into a waiting police car, his face twisted in a mixture of rage and disbelief. Inside the bus, the passengers erupted into applause. The teenage girl clapped loudly, her grin wide. "Finally, some justice," she exclaimed. The young man with the phone turned back to Snoop, still recording. "Man, that was incredible. Everyone's going to see this?" Snoop gave him a faint smile, his composure softening for the first time. "Good. Maybe it'll make people think twice about staying silent." The officer who had arrested Henderson stepped back onto the bus, addressing Snoop directly. "Sir, we're going to make sure this gets properly documented. Do you want to press charges?" Snoop nodded firmly. "Absolutely." The officer tipped his hat slightly. "We'll handle the rest from here." "You just sit tight!" As the officer exited again, the crowd outside cheered, their chants shifting to Snoop's name. Snoop Dogg had become the face of defiance, a quiet but powerful figure standing tall against injustice. The bus doors closed, and the replacement driver, a young woman with kind eyes, climbed aboard. She glanced at Snoop and smiled. "Where to next?" she asked, her tone light but respectful. Snoop relaxed into his seat, his shoulders finally easing. "Forward," he said simply. The police cruiser carrying Michael Henderson sped away from the scene, its sirens wailing faintly as it disappeared down the street. The crowd outside the bus erupted into cheers and applause, their voices echoing in unison. Inside, the energy shifted. The passengers who had been wary and hesitant before now buzzed with a mix of relief and triumph. Snoop remained seated at the front, his posture as poised as ever. He rubbed his arm where Henderson had grabbed him, his hand lingering briefly before returning to his lap. The young man with the phone moved closer, his recording still running. "Man, you okay?" he asked, his voice softer than before, the defiance he'd shown to Henderson having given way to genuine concern. "I'm fine," Snoop replied, his voice steady. He met his gaze, his tone carrying a quiet strength. "It'll take more than that to shake me. The teenage girl stepped forward, clutching her backpack against her chest.
You were amazing,
She said, her eyes wide with admiration.
I can't believe you stood up to him like that.
It wasn't just for me, Snoop said, his gaze sweeping across the other passengers. Sometimes you have to take a stand, even if it's uncomfortable. His words seemed to resonate. The man in the suit, who had remained quiet for much of the ordeal, finally spoke up.
You've got more courage than most people, Mr.
Dogg, he said with a small nod. You've inspired all of us today. That man deserved everything he got. The young mother, still holding her child tightly, leaned forward from her seat.
I'm sorry I didn't speak up sooner,
she admitted, her voice tinged with guilt. I didn't want to make things worse. Snoop offered her a kind smile. It's never easy, especially when fear takes over, but every voice matters. Remember that next time. The young man holding the phone interrupted, turning his screen towards Snoop. Your video is already blowing up. I just checked. Tens of thousands of views. People are sharing it everywhere. Snoop raised an eyebrow, the corner of his lips curling slightly. Well, he said, it seems the truth has its way of getting out. Before anyone could respond, the replacement driver, a petite woman with a calm, authoritative demeanor, stepped onto the bus. She adjusted her uniform cap and scanned the faces in the aisle, her expression professional yet kind. Good morning, she said, her voice cutting through the chatter. I'll be taking over for the rest of the route. Sorry for the delay, folks. She glanced at Snoop, a flicker of recognition crossing her face. Mr. Dogg? She asked, her tone respectful. Snoop inclined his head. Yes, I just want to say thank you, the driver said. What you did today, it's not just for you, it's for all of us. The bus fell silent, the weight of her words settling over everyone. Snoop nodded, his gratitude unspoken but evident in his expression. The driver returned to her seat, and the bus hummed to life again, finally moving forward. As they continued their route, the passengers began talking among themselves, sharing their perspectives on what had happened. Some debated how Henderson had kept his job for so long, while others expressed outrage at the system that had allowed his behavior to persist. Snoop listened quietly, his presence a steady anchor amid the buzz of voices. The young man with the phone eventually sat beside him, lowering his camera for the first time. What happens next? He asked. Snoop turned to him, his expression thoughtful. I press charges, he said firmly, and then we see where the fight takes us. He nodded slowly. I think a lot of people are going to want to help. Your video, it's bigger than just this bus. It has to be, Snoop replied. Change doesn't come from silence. The teenage girl, now sitting across from them, leaned forward. Do you think they'll fire him for good? Snoop's lips tightened briefly. I don't know, he admitted. But whatever happens to him, I'll make sure people see what he stood for. That's what matters. The bus pulled up to the next stop and a handful of passengers disembarked. Outside, the crowd had thinned slightly, but a few people remained, waving their signs and cheering as Snoop glanced at them through the window. He raised his hand in acknowledgement, a subtle but powerful gesture that drew another wave of applause. As the bus moved on, Snoop felt a sense of resolve settle over him. The road ahead would not be easy, he knew that much, but for the first time, he felt that the voices around him, once silent, had found strength. And that was a victory in itself.